list. So let's take one step backwards though. The idea of this checklist or outline, if you want to call it, is to understand if you're looking at a parole evidence rule problem, what are the steps I'm going to take to make sure I address every part of the rule and not skip ahead or go back and forth to make my answer mirror the rule. Who can read me the rule for parole evidence that you guys were given last session by Professor Ryan? Yeah, and you can tell me your name, that'd be great.
Carly.
Carly, yeah, go for it.
Okay. Where the parties to a contract express their agreement in writing with the intent that it embodies the final expression of their bargain, any other expressions, written or oral, made prior to the writing, as well as any oral expressions contemporaneous with the writing, are inadmissible to vary the terms of the writing.
Great. So let's take that up and sort of parcel it together, right? Part 1 is saying where the parties to the contract express their agreement in writing. So if we're taking that part from the rule and we're trying to fill in number 1, is there, and Carly, can you fill that in for me?
Writing?
Yeah, a written agreement, right? Step 1 for the parole evidence rule is simply going to be, do we even have something in writing to look at? Assuming that's met, we're going to move on to the second part of the rule. And again, I want to re-emphasize this idea of mirroring. If the first part of the rule says written agreement, we don't want to jump ahead to the end and do exceptions, right? We want to say yes or no, there's an agreement. We'll see this in the problem you guys did for today, and it's sometimes as simple as, yes, there's an agreement because they signed a contract on X day, which is what we have in today's problem. All right, so answer to 1 was written agreement. Step 2, is the written agreement then, and Carly, do you want to follow up with me and take a stab at what that second blank would be?
Sure. Is the writing a complete integration?
Great. So the way that I phrase it, and then complete integration is correct too, is intended as a final integration, because we're going to have to look at a little bit of what the parties have done. So I took that a step further, but you're definitely on the right track there. And improving final integration, there's really 3 parts we can look to, and that I've broken down into A, B, and C, because they're not separate parts of the rule, they break down one element of the rule. Do people sort of see how that works now? Okay, so within integration and the party's intent to do so, who can give me one of the 3 ways we might prove that? One of the 3 triggers or facts we'd look for, and yeah, again, tell me your name?
Kimberly.
Kimberly, yeah, take a stab at it.
Does it supplement?
Okay, so
Change it or something?
So I'm going to pause you for a second. You're in the right rule area as far as parole evidence rule, but what Kimberly's showing us here is we're jumping outside of the element we're in, right? Right now we're saying, did the parties agree to make this final? So you're not wrong, but I just want to redirect your focus of where we're at now so you can take it step by step. Do you want to take one other, do you have another guess or another try?
Is it within the 4 corners?
Okay, that's right. So we're going to look, is it the nature of the agreement is maybe where you're going.
Okay.
I think you're on the right idea. Again, the whole part of doing this process isn't making things right or wrong, but understanding where I am in the problem to help me to ground myself. So I'll go ahead and just read the 3 things to you because maybe it'll make a little more sense. So when we're looking at something that's intention of the parties to be finally or a final integration, we're going to look for one huge thing is a merger clause. Hopefully this is sounding a little familiar. The second thing would be extrinsic evidence that prove the party's intent. And then the final part would be the nature of the agreement. So are these kinds of terms ordinarily or usually the types of terms that embody an agreement to be fully integrated? And I'm happy to repeat those if you guys need.
Please.
Yeah, so the first was a merger clause. That would be A. B would be extrinsic evidence proving the party's intent. Parties being plural, both parties. And then the last item that can help us prove integration is the nature of the agreement. And just to help explain a little bit more, we're going to look at the terms ordinarily included in this type of agreement. Are there the essential terms, things of that nature? And again, right now we're just trying to establish our checklist so we can apply it to the problem you guys did for today. Is everybody with me so far on that? Any questions? And Kimberly, I don't mean to come back to you, but do you see now how the word integration has 3 subcomponents that help us say yes or no to that question?
Yeah.
As opposed to looking maybe a little bit farther ahead and missing other topics?
Mm-hmm.
Good, so as you guys do this for other classes, it's important that when you're looking at a rule and you're breaking it down piece by piece, sometimes a statement in the rule might be broken down into 3 sub-elements as it is here, It's really important to understand why things go in the place they do, not only to understand the rule and the elements to it, but to be able to mirror that on an exam and not miss points and really be able to address the topic completely. Okay, anyone want to help me out with number 3 that feels comfortable with it? I know there's a lot of blanks, but I can help you through it if you're willing to work through it. Nobody? Oh, come on. So you guys talked about it. Let's go to this side of the room. I know that did it. Yeah, up here up front.
I'm gonna take a stab at it.
That's all I ask, yeah.
What other expressions were made?
Okay, so the blank we're trying to fill in is, okay, you guys just have what? It's a little not as helpful as what I have in front of me. So it's, what evidence is the party offering?
Okay.
So you're on the right idea. I'm going to give you guys really clear-cut language, though, so you can understand that it mirrors the rule piece by piece. Because if I go back to the rule we were given, the next part of the rule was any other expressions, written or oral, so it's going to be other evidence the party is offering. So now A, B, and C are going to be sort of 3 separate questions. Do you have an idea of what A might be?
Conversations prior to writing.
Great, yeah, so keyword there, you pull that grade, A. So A is going to be, is the party offering a written or oral statement prior to the written agreement? And then I'll give you guys B so we can talk about them together. B is going to be, or is it contemporaneous with the written agreement, meaning at the same time? And the reason why we have those asterisks, and maybe it'll make a little bit more sense now, is if something is made prior to or during, contemporaneously with the written agreement, we're going to be subject to the parole evidence rule, because it's things that are made prior or during. If it's something that's made after the written agreement, the parole evidence rule doesn't apply. It's just the way the rule works. It's for things made before an agreement or during, not after. So it's a nuance to the rule. It's important because if we have a contract that's on February 1st and we're trying to bring in something on February 7th, we don't even need to discuss the parole evidence rule. So that kind of fills in C for us, right? If it's after, the parole evidence rule won't bar it.
Say anything about C.
Yeah, so C is going to say that if the party is offering a written or oral statement made after the written agreement that we've identified in step 1, we're not going to be concerned with the parole evidence rule. And as subtopic room or I says, if the answer is yes, the evidence is not barred by PER because it can be offered to show subsequent modifications. So what I've done for you guys here in these first 3 steps is walk you through what do we generally need to look at in establishing whether parole evidence rule might even be relevant. Now, honest question, have I lost anybody this far? And yes is a totally acceptable answer. Yes.
Can you just repeat? You said if the answer is yes, the evidence is not barred because it can be offered to show subsequent
Modifications. Yeah. So again, the idea of you guys filling this in isn't necessarily taking my word for word for what we have in the outline or the checklist, but thinking about the steps you would take as the way the rule works. And again, I'm going to emphasize this idea of mirroring the rule for you guys because it's a really important step to outlining and taking to other classes. So if you're in torts and you're mirroring duty or breach, you're going to talk about the different types in a very similar methodical fashion on the way that's broken down for you guys. Okay. So number 4 is going to wrap up, and I'm going to look at this side of the room because I know this is what you guys worked on. Who wants to take a stab at 4? If it's being offered for 3 different things, then it is blank. And I'll give you the blank. What 3 things, if it's being offered for, make it inadmissible? And that's going to be the last blank you guys fill in. Did I? Yeah. That's okay, so you didn't understand what my question was?
Yeah.
So there's going to be 3, so the question says, are prior or written oral statements, so we're basically saying if A or B are met in 3, meaning it was made before or during the written agreement, then it has to be offered for, if it's offered in 3 different ways, we won't allow it in. Yeah, see, so you have to kind of rephrase. That's why my words might not work for you, but it's taking the idea. Okay, so we've met 1, we've met 2, we've said, okay, 3, the parole evidence rule might apply, and you want to take it, remind me of your name?
Emil.
Emil, go ahead and take a stab at it.
I think you're trying to vary, contradict, or modify the contract.
Super, that's exactly right. Can you tell me where you got that so maybe those who didn't get it might have an idea with
I got it from here, from the packet.
Yeah, no, exactly right. So see, Emil's doing a really great job of taking the rule that was given to him by a professor, or in this case, Professor Ryan, and thinking about if I'm breaking it down into pieces. I know, I'm really, this is a very honest, it's a great step. It's not always going to be as difficult as creating something out of thin air. You're oftentimes given what you need, and it's breaking it down into small, bite-sized chunks that make it workable for an exam. So in this case, that if something's offered to vary, contradict, or modify, it's not going to be admissible. It's going to be inadmissible, meaning the parole evidence rule would bar it from being talked about. And in those 4 steps now, we've broken down what can be kind of a difficult thing to process, the parole evidence rule. We've set up the rule in 4 steps for you guys. Although, 2 steps have 3 subcomponents to them, it's still 4 steps. Now, with that being said, if the parole evidence rule does or does not apply, we still have 5 is going to be a carve out for exceptions. I'm hoping to who noticed that the 5th was going to be a carve out for exceptions to the parole evidence rule. Good. I'm glad to see a few hands. That's really great. I know you guys didn't have a chance to work on it, but it's nice to see your hands up. And just for the essence of time, I'm going to walk us through the exceptions here. So again, 1 through 4 set up the parole evidence rule for us, and we would decide if it did or did not apply. And then 5 is going to be the exception. So A is going to be defects in formation. Oh, sorry, let me actually fill in all the blanks, sorry. Are there any exceptions? So that's going to be the first blank. Your second blank is going to be, these are situations where prior or contemporaneous oral written statements are admissible. So we're going to have A, B, C, I guess that's 6, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 7. 7 exceptions where things that would have otherwise been inadmissible under the parole evidence rule might have a chance to come in and be talked about. So A is going to be defects in formation. So that's going to be things like fraud, duress, mistake, an illegal contract to begin with. Things that make the contract itself null and void from the get-go. And those would have happened at the time the contract was made. Again, don't focus on all the words I'm saying, more of the idea that the exception is going to be a defect in the formation will let us bypass the parole evidence rule. The second is going to be interpretation of terms. So if the terms themselves are a little bit ambiguous, or we're not sure what they mean, perhaps we will bypass the parole evidence rule and hear the outside evidence that the one party wants to offer. C is going to be it's admissible if it's to prove a collateral agreement. And does anyone not know what a collateral agreement, or want me to just take a few minutes? Yeah, that's fine, and that's okay. So a collateral agreement is going to be an agreement that was made on the side, something relating to but not in the written contract. So it's going to be like related to the subject matter, but not part of the primary promise. So I think this is one thing students get a little tripped up on. It's going to be like, if I want to be a landlord to a property that I own and I need to have a tenant, and the tenant wants to do a lease to buy, we might contract for the lease portion and separately say, well, after a year we'll talk about buying it, but not put that to writing. That would otherwise be barred by the parole evidence rule, but since it was a collateral agreement and may be conditional upon you leasing, I'll only lease your building if I have the option to buy it after a year, that would be a collateral agreement. Does that make sense? Okay, sometimes it's nice to have a real life example. Okay, so then E is going to be a subsequent modification or agreement. Oh, I'm sorry, thank you. That's reformation of the writing. So that's going to be like a typo or something where it's the party's going to say, no, that was never intended to be there. That was a typo or a clerical mistake, something like that. The parole evidence rule will be able to bypass the parole evidence rule. E is going to be a subsequent modification or agreement. Yeah, a subsequent modification or agreement. And this kind of hints back at 3C, where we ask when it was made, because it's an exception because the parole evidence rule doesn't bar it, and we sort of laid that in 3C. So again, if this was your checklist, you'd almost have 2 spots where you can sort of see that, but the best place to talk about it would be as an exception. Because If after 3C you said it wasn't barred, you would jump to the exception, explain why it would still come in. And we'll see that in the problem for today. F would be a condition precedent, or precedent, however you'd like to say it. And this just means that the parties agreed that the contract wouldn't become even enforceable until some condition was met. So I'll lease your room from you when you get rid of your dog. If I haven't gotten rid of my dog, our agreement could be proven with outside evidence.
How is that different from 3A?
From 3A. Well, so it's 3A is asking, was the agreement made before the contract? And if so, it's going to be barred by the parole evidence rule. So what 5F is doing, our condition precedent, saying that even if otherwise the parole evidence rule would apply, we have these exceptions. So just like in, I'm trying to give a class from first year where we have exceptions that were really easy to know. Nothing's jumping in my head. So just because we have a rule, we still might have exceptions. So if we've gone through our analysis and the rule's met, saying that no, this won't be able to come in, we still might have an exception that lets it come in, even though the rule said no. That's the whole point of an exception with the law. We'll hit more on it in the problem. I think it'll make a little bit more sense. I just want to give you guys this really rough checklist. And then G is going to be promissory estoppel, which hopefully sounds a little familiar from first semester of contracts. And again, just the real issue with promissory estoppel is it's going to be this detrimentally relied, that a promise was detrimentally relied on. Okay. So that's a lot of information to take in 30 minutes, I know. But what I want to encourage you guys to do with this before we move on to the problem is what we've sort of done here in small groups and together and in this big group is take down a rule that seems really complex and find a way to make it bite-sized bits and away. And again, if you were to see this now that your checklist is filled in and you saw the problem that you guys worked on and turned in on Tuesday, this would have made the problem a lot easier, right? I mean, and the answer is yes. It's sort of a rhetorical question. But what I encourage you guys to do, and this is part of the outlining process and the reviewing process with, in this case, contracts or really any class, is taking that time to take a rule that you kind of understand as a whole and make it subparts that make sense. This is why a lot of first-year students love crim law, right? Because it was so element-based. It made it really easy to understand what do I need to address to make this crime, to convict of this crime or not convict. Every class should have a similar structure if you take enough time to think about it. So here we've taken the parole evidence rule and I've broken it down into 5 steps, or five elements, I'm counting the exception as an element, or points that we've broken down further. So if I had this in front of me, and was going through an exam, if I had this in my head, I would be able to go piece by piece and pull out every fact that I needed to say yes or no to each of these questions, right? As we'll learn later in the semester with you guys, deciding whether to talk about it on an exam or not is a whole nother skill set. But the skill set I want you guys to try and take away from today and this week is being able to create these big checklists for topics so you can go through a fact pattern and pull out what you need to say yes or no to all these questions. In a way, it's helping you guys issue spot. Now, any questions on what we just did, and they can be to repeat things or clarification or anything like that. Yeah, if you can just let me know your name.
Melanie?
Melanie, yeah.
I want to know the difference between condition precedent and collateral.
Sure. I'll answer your question just briefly because I think I'm going to encourage you to go home and take a little time to do it for yourself. But I'll give you just sort of the general gist since I did offer up questions. A collateral agreement is going to be something that we make on the side but relates to. So again, back to my lease, right? If I say that I'll lease you a room in my house and we agree to that, but on the side I've also said and I'll lease you the room, but you can keep your car in the driveway. We may have not contracted about keeping the car in the driveway in the document we're looking at, the written agreement in front of us, but it was collateral too because you would not have otherwise made that contract with me if you had to put your car on the street. Does that make sense? It's completely related to the contract we made, but not in the actual writing. But a condition precedent is going to be, again, I won't lease your room until you let me keep the car in the driveway. Let's say it's a 1-car driveway and I have my car in there now, so I have to sell my car. So that means that the contract wouldn't even be together or wouldn't even be enforceable until that condition was met. Again, I think bigger picture though is just realizing that that's an exception. So if you see something that kind of looks like that, you might want to try and talk about it as that the parole evidence rule may not apply. Does that clarify a little bit for you? But the idea is, I mean, think about it even more larger though, the parole evidence rule is the parole, I'm just going to call it PER. PER wants to keep stuff out that's going to overcomplicate the agreement or change the terms that parties have already agreed to. We don't want to do an after-the-fact change to a contract that both parties agreed on. But the exceptions are things that the courts have found to be times when maybe the parole evidence rule isn't necessary because there was more going on than the writing lets on to be. It helps enough. I'm encouraging you to again, just remember it's an exception. Those are two very minor exceptions. We just list them all for you guys to have a complete checklist. I saw another hand. Yeah, and your name?
Alexandra,
Yeah, Alexandra.
defects in formation, is that like when they forget to include something?
So that's gonna, again, I love that you guys are thinking these different ideas that might come up. This is what this checklist is supposed to do. How are we gonna real life things or fact patterns are gonna come up with this? But again, defects in formation are gonna be more like fraud, duress, or coercion, mistake. Sort of a lot of these things you'll learn a little bit during this semester, and maybe, I think you guys learned, did you guys touch on fraud last semester in contracts?
Avoid enforcement,
Yeah, so exactly, to avoid enforcement, exactly. So that's just saying that if something was defective from the get-go, if I had a gun to my head in signing the contract, and I want to let the judge know there's a picture of me with a gun to my head, they're going to let that in because it shows that the contract from the get-go wasn't even enforceable. Okay. So now with the remaining 30 minutes we have, I really want to walk through the problem you guys did for today. As far as I know, everyone should have a hard copy in front of them of their problem. And now that you guys have this general outline for sort of any time we see a parole evidence rule, how we're going to go by it, step by step, very methodical. We're going to mirror the rule in our IRAC formation, right? Who can remind me what IRAC is? Carly, since you look so eager.
Issue, rule, analysis, conclusion.
Great. Okay. So with that being said, each one of these numbers would have a separate IRAC, right? We'd start out with the first IRAC that's going to say, the issue here is whether, let me make sure I get these names right and don't confuse you. The issue is whether Kane's testimony about the December 14th phone call should be admitted under the parole evidence rule, right? But that's going to be our main issue. And then we're going to lay out the rule for parole evidence rule. And then we're going to say that it was met because, and then conclude. But what I want to break down for you guys is each IRAC is going to have, or each element is going to have, not each element, sorry, each rule is going to have a separate IRAC to it. So for instance, these 5 steps that we've created 5 steps for our analysis, four steps, because we're not dealing with exceptions first, that create why the parole evidence rule either applies or doesn't apply. Does that make sense? So now looking back at your guys' problems, I'm not sure, because I don't have your guys' actual in front of me, how many of you guys did or did not do that, but it's important that we try and mirror the rule in our explanation and our analysis. To sort of help explain, I think, because this is getting a little bit up in the air as far as what it looks like, I'm going to pass out a sample answer, but when I call on you guys, I want you not necessarily to read the sample answer as I call on you, because that defeats the purpose, or if you raise your hand, but look at it and compare it to your answer and sort of see how the structure and the bold parts reflect the outline we just made. Give me 1 second. You guys can just take one and pass it back. Okay. So. Yes, go for it.
How are we supposed to get this information out of our meeting and the problem if we didn't have this breakdown? It's not broken down.
That's a great question. Remind me one more time of your name. So, everybody, Kimberly asked a really great question. She was saying, how are we supposed to be able, did everyone get one? We might be short one. Everyone got one? Okay, great. So Kimberly asked a really great question. She's like, without this session in your help basically, how are we supposed to break down other classes, other rules, right? Well, I'm gonna encourage you guys to really take the time between your readings, where you maybe you got an idea of what the parole evidence rule is, and your help with Professor Heilman, and I'm only gonna focus on contracts right now. You had an idea of what this rule meant, right? And I'm pretty sure Professor Heilman gave you the exact rule that Carly read earlier, right?
No.
It was on the,
It should be on a slide, or I'm not asking. I guess my point being is you guys are given some tools that put you in the direction of trying to establish what the rule may be. It's your job after that to try and break it down in pieces that seem small and simple. Elements, you know. Again, I put you guys back to crim law because that topic is just so it emphasizes elements, right? You learn it as, you know, burglary is 5 elements, and what does each element mean? And Professor Ryan talked about this a little bit in her session. It's a struggle process of taking the information you have, whether it be through class notes and case briefs, and trying to create a topic like this. And then if you still have questions, either meeting with a dean's fellow, preferably your TA for that class, or a professor, and trying to make sure you're on the right track. It's a constant checking in and saying, did I break this down properly? So there's no magic solution that I'm going to throw a session like this for every rule in every class. It's teaching you guys the skills of looking at a rule. Usually you can get a rule from class. I'll make that as a pretty fair, you know, whether it makes sense to you or not is a whole other question. And if it makes sense to you, then it might be easier to break down.
But, excuse me, we
Yeah.
didn't get an actual rule in our class when we get into Professor Ryan, so I'm just saying, we're supposed to come up with our own rule, I guess.
No. I would never really expect you to come up with your own rule out of thin air. It's either going to be in the cases you read, a professor's emphasis. I mean, all of these, because this is the rule of law. Carly looking at me like I'm a little crazy. Do you have a... No, I'm happy to hear your guys', because this is where the part you guys have to sort of learn. Yes.
Okay, I'm just only comparing it to the contracts class that I had
Yeah.
the first semester. So like I had Professor Hart, and like when she gave us the rules, there were certain like parts within the rule
Mhm.
that also required like different definitions. Like for example, like what a written agreement was.
Mhm.
And so with him, it's difficult because not only he kind of goes over the cases, and so like I know what she's talking about because we know what the parole evidence rule is. We can talk about it, but when you come to apply it, you kind of don't know. Okay, like what do I discuss first? What do I discuss next?
So-
What do I break down?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I'll remind you guys though, so if you're talking specifically about contracts, remember that this course is intended to have this sort of component, right, where we're going to be supplying you guys with a little bit of outside information. So Professor Heilman's making the decision of what to include in class and what to supply us with. So in this case, he may have not broken down the rule as clearly because he knew we were going to spend an hour on it. So in that regard, I will give, you know what I mean, like remember that component to it. But, remember your name?
Amelia.
As Amelia points out with Professor Hart last semester, she said she would give her the rule and explain to her which components maybe need to be broken down further, and then from there it was your job to find out, well, what are the bounds of what is in or outside that component, right? Most professors are going to do this for you. I would say all professors, but I don't know all the professors you guys are going to have this semester. I know most of them. This is what you are learning to do. Take a rule, break it down. The professors are there to help you. So there are pieces in the courses you guys take that help you do this. We're not expecting you to do it on your own. Yeah, one other question?
The only issue I had when doing this was
Yeah.
that Adam actually did give us the elements, but he broke it down to 3 as opposed to the 4 that you guys kind of did.
Right.
So I just did his 3 since I'm assuming on his exam I'll have to do his 3 anyway.
So we met with him to create this, and I think we further I think he made the decision to break it down into one more element. Because the 4 are going to be the parole evidence and the 5th are going to be exceptions. I think because he thought it was easier for you guys, again, to mirror on an exam. Because it made each section of application manageable. Yeah, everything we do in these sessions are checked off and signed off by him. So you won't, not everything, most of what I tell you guys and everything I hand out is as good as gold from Professor Heilman because he approves everything we do for this. So, but that's a very good question. Okay, so what I'd like to do now, and again, I have no problem with you guys sort of stopping me halfway through if things get confusing. If we're running low on time, I'll tell you. I'd like to kind of quickly go through the problem you guys did and break down each of these elements with what would be, the analysis. Because I've given you guys the rules. We kind of talked about what the general issue statement's going to be. But how do we do this really hard part of application, right? Pulling specific facts from a fact pattern to fill in the holes. Imagine that under each one of these blanks we just filled in, we had an example line, or what facts apply. And your job then is to type them out in sentences. This is a written agreement because. This is intended as a final integration of the parties, yes or no, because. And that because may have 4 or 5 lines after, depending on the fact pattern. But that's where you guys are going to now focus. We've taken the rule, we've broken it into pieces. Now we're mirroring the rule in the facts through our application paragraph. And as you guys can see in the sample I gave you, question 1 is going to be the parole evidence rule. And question 2 is going to be almost all of the exceptions. I know that may have been hard to tell from the actual question you guys, like when you guys first did the problem. But let's skim through question 1, and then we'll attack the exceptions. So, again, we have the issue. You guys can see the rule we've talked about ad nauseum sort of today. And then A, the application. So, what I'd like to do is if you guys can just take a quick second and review it, and in the essence of time, if there are any facts that you guys have a question on or didn't understand in writing your own sample answers, let's bring those up and attack it that way. Otherwise, I'll move on to I think what was a little bit more difficult, which was the exception part. Oh, and let me remind you, the bold and the I's and the R's and the A's and the C's and brackets aren't there for you guys to do the same thing. It's just there to make it very easy for you guys to navigate. Does that make sense? So we don't expect your answers to be bolded. We don't expect them to have the weird brackets. In fact, don't do that. That's just to help you guys understand. Yes?
For those of us that had Professor Hart, I don't know for anybody else that had the other contracts professors, but Professor Hart doesn't necessarily do like an IRAC method. Hers is a little bit different.
So I'm going to enforce IRAC as a must.
Okay, is that for Professor Highland though? Because I just want to make sure like how we're supposed to write his exam as opposed to like an exam for a different professor.
I am going to profusely encourage IRAC, and in fact, for any student that I have or anything I'm reviewing, I require it. There's no reason to not be an IRAC. The only exception that I've ever seen, although a professor may not require it, to write effectively, IRAC is what it takes. And there's only one professor on campus that I know that doesn't like IRAC, and that's because he likes HIRAC, which adds one heading to it. So it's IRAC with a heading. So, yeah, exactly. So I'm going to enforce IRAC as well as every other Dean's Fellow, and there's really no reason to not IRAC. In fact, there is no reason not to IRAC. So I know Professor Hart doesn't require it, but it makes it a lot easier to read, and we're requiring it of you guys. So IRAC is a must. This is how we're going to hope your guys' subsequent papers look. Maybe not this detail or this exact, but at least the structure. Okay, so written agreement we have really clearly. We actually see in the problem, right, a contract between the two people. Check it off, move on, written agreements met. Intent of both parties. So here's where we're going to look at the integration, right? And we have those 3 subcomponents. Do we see a merger clause? Okay, so is that a pro or a con towards integration? Pro means that it's more likely integrated. Great. So you say the intent of both parties was to be integrated because we see a merger clause in section 5. The intention of the parties is further supported in section 6, right? And you're pulling these exact facts. Does everyone have a copy of the problem? Okay, great. No. Well, look on your neighbor then. Next time, bring it with you. It's going to make it a lot easier for us to be able to talk. So the additional provision, right, is what we're talking about in section 6. All these things help us realize the parties probably agreed to be integrated. And then we move on to the next application paragraph. Yes?
Would you, if I had a problem with when I was writing the exam, would you argue that it wasn't an integration for the other side?
So, yes, you could. And I'm going to say if you did that there's nothing wrong with that. What we're going to learn later on this semester is deciding when and when not to make that call of do I need to have a counter argument or not. I think because the merger clause here was so clear and then followed up with that provision 6, the other side's argument was really weak. So our sample answer didn't reflect it, but if you talked about it in saying that, well, maybe the merger clause wasn't intended to be a merger clause, is that what you're kind of thinking?
No, because I know that for the 4 corners, the merger clause actually proves the complete integration, but for the modern approach, it's okay. It's good that it's there, but it's
right. Okay, so yeah, that's great. So you're taking it a little step farther than I'd like to today. We're going to just take it as sort of the merger clause is just very indicative of it being fully integrated. And although you make a really good point that some courts may not find a merger clause to be totally making it fully integrated all the time, I think because of the facts and it being more likely than not that it was integrated, we're just going to leave it at that. But if you went and talked about a counter argument, there was nothing wrong with that. I think it may have gone a little bit beyond what the problem was asking for. Okay, so notice you guys, we go issue rule, we apply the writing and the intent integration component. Then we do a whole separate application paragraph about would it be considered an oral exception made prior to the writing. Again, every time we have another application paragraph, it's moving from one section of the rule to the next, and so on. Yes?
So did you not have a separate application paragraph for written agreement because it's pretty
Because it was one sentence. If you had entered and then indented again for a new paragraph, nothing wrong with that. Just for the purpose of trying to keep it a little bit logical and in order. But yes, that's the reason why. And then notice we have 2 application paragraphs, but still a conclusion, right? And what did we conclude based on the facts we pulled from the exam? Right, should not be admitted. Great. Again, conclusions aren't yes or no. It's not about having the right conclusion. It's about making a conclusion. Any questions on problem 1? I'm going to leave it for you guys. It was simple in the fact that there were some really key facts that highlight some of the stuff we talked about in our checklist. And I find the exceptions to be a little more difficult, so I want to move on to those if everyone's okay with that. So what I want to focus your attention on... Was there a question? No? Okay. What I want to focus your guys' attention on is that question 2... where did question 2 go? Question 2 was asking about exceptions. Now, how many of you guys talked about exceptions, more than one exception in question 2? Okay, great. And how many of you guys thought when you saw the question, you thought, oh, one exception and I can be done? No, it's a very honest question. Yeah, right? Because sometimes it's like, oh, it wants an exception, let's move on and be done. What I want to remind you guys of is that by creating our checklist we did in the beginning, if you were to look back at this problem now, would you have talked about more than one exception? Right, and again, I'm trying to re-emphasize the importance of this checklist because I was really bad about this my first year. You know, I'd be so quick to jump to the exception that was the most significant or the strongest to argue. And I got back my cut sheet on my midterm and was like, wait, what do you mean I had to talk about 4 other exceptions that are really weak arguments? And I realized that if I had a more detailed checklist that I really stuck to, even if it meant writing 2 sentences, this exception does not apply because, this exception does not apply because, and I did D, E, F, and G that way, and I was irritated the entire time, it was sometimes 10 points on the exam by knowing that that exception didn't apply and pulling the fact out why. Or something as simple as, this is a written agreement because we see a contract signed by both parties. And I'm like, why do I have to spend time talking about that? Because you don't meet the rule unless you explain every element. So again, now that we've given you guys this checklist, I encourage you to create similar things for every class because it'll help you not miss steps in the process. And I'm sure none of you guys purposely miss steps. If you don't have a backbone to go to, it's easy to do, especially under the stress of an exam. So here in the sample answers you guys see, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 separate IRACs, right? And the first IRAC is setting up our really general answer to the question. If the parole evidence rule says that the December 14th phone call is not admissible under the parole evidence rule, how else can we get it in? Or, instead, in other words, what exceptions apply? Again, we break down what the rule of the parole evidence rule is.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Do we have to do this in this problem? Because I kind of skipped over the first part of part 2 that just goes over the parole evidence because it was such a clear-cut case and he just has to argue exceptions because there's no way he can argue the 3 main elements.
So I'm going to...
It might be different for a different test where they give us more where you could wiggle out of it, but I felt like this problem was so clear-cut that they wanted us just to go to the
So this is sort of why I give my anecdotal story, because you're making a judgment call that I don't think is always going to be the correct one. In fact, often I think it's not going to be. I say if it's that clear-cut to you, write and give me 2 or 3 sentences why it's so clear-cut. Because if it is that clear cut, it's not going to take up a lot of your time. And in writing that out or thinking about that, you might realize that maybe it wasn't as cut and dry as you thought it was. In this case, it wasn't, but I don't, what we're trying to build here is not an answer to this problem, but a process for you guys to go by to avoid making the mistakes that may have cost you more than you realize, or the mistakes that lead to sort of, sorry, I don't want to use the word mistakes, maybe just the missing steps in the process that cost more than you guys realize. Like, I was a victim of it first semester, and that's why I just want to remind you guys that, like, this works for everybody. I still do this on an exam. Yeah.
Karen was heavily focused on restatements and memorization of those restatements and applying to the facts. Howman is not.
So I think your question's going to personal preferences of professors. You have to do kind of what they want in that regard. But what we're giving you guys as skills is not going to change from class to class. What we're having you guys do here is an IRAC structure where we're issue spotting, stating the rule, pulling the facts from the exam, and putting them to which specific elements they go to. Yeah, Deneen, you want to interject?
Hi, Karen. Restatements are the rules.
Yeah.
It's the exact same thing. It's just instead of her giving you the rule, she gives you the restatement, which is the rule.
And actually, I know not all of you guys had Professor Karen, but I'm going to use this as actually the side note for a professor. So let's say you guys had Professor Karen in a separate class that wasn't contracts. She really loves restatements. So she takes them right from the the UCC or the restatements, and that's what she used as her rule. But even notice there in class, every slide had maybe 4 or 5 words that were bolded and italicized in yellow. For those of you that didn't have Professor Karen, she used a slide. She'll put a restatement up on there, and let's say the restatement's 20 words. 4 of the words are italicized and highlighted in yellow. What do you think those italicized and highlighted in yellow words would be in our checklist? Yeah, there you go. So I know it sounds really simple, but now you can sort of see why, like seeing how the professor structures it can help you understand how to break down the rule. Okay. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to go through each exception and see what facts would have triggered us to talk about that. So I know a lot of you guys probably talked about one exception, but let's see why you guys didn't talk about the other ones. Maybe because they didn't cross your mind, maybe the facts didn't jump at you, but I want to start to process why we maybe didn't talk about some of the other ones. So like I said, the first IRAC just basically sets up question 2. We've moved on to something different. We need to put our groundwork down, right? We're talking about exceptions to the parole evidence rule. Here's the rule. They likely might have, or then our conclusion is would not have a very strong argument that they would apply. So the first one is going to be ambiguity or interpretation, right? I think that's one of our letters on there. And then we're going to point to section 6.1, and who can pull up 6.1 for me on the fact pattern or tell me what it says? Yeah, go for it.
Compensation of managers. Profit percentages for managers are guaranteed only for the first 2 years of employment. The company reserves the right to adjust percentages in subsequent years based on the profitability of the local branch.
Great. So if you had to pull one word out of there, you're like, what is that going to mean for these people? Can anyone tell me, or did someone pull it out in there? Yeah.
Profitability.
Great. So you've read this giant clause about the parties are going to do this and do that, and it's all revolving around profitability. Well, what does profitability mean? If I was looking at my checklist and had this moment of like, well, what does that mean? The exception of ambiguity or how we can interpret that term would come to mind. And then it would hopefully trigger that I need to talk about that as an exception. Do people see now that if you have your checklist in your head or next to you, you might actually see that something you thought, not a big deal, might apply now? Yeah. Anyone who's not with me, please feel free and I can dive into it more. Okay. So then again, by pulling that specific fact out and pointing section 6.1 lists profitability, but based on the rest of the document, we're not really sure what profitability means. Therefore, maybe the interpretation exception might apply. And then you would say that, he's trying to offer testimony that would show that it only meant for a raise in percentage as opposed to a decrease. Again, we're just really trying to, once you have your checklist, root yourself in the facts. Pull out what really is going to help you or work against you and use those specifics. Okay, how about fraud in this case was the next issue, right? Again, notice we have the issue is fraud, formation defects or fraud. We state the rule. Parole evidence rule does not apply to evidence offered to establish that the contract is invalid because of formation defects such as fraud. It's one of our exceptions. And again, we have a nice application paragraph again. And what facts are we going to pull out to help us show that there may have been fraud?
The facts that are in here. Well, I mean, I talked about it too in mine like differently. I don't think I talked about this exception specifically, but I did talk about how the conversation before he accepted the job, where the company, who's Adams, like the company manager.
Yeah, it's just not a big deal about who the
Yeah,
parties are.
he,
Just
he told Keynes that usually that clause is put in there, but usually like just as a formality, but usually that the profitability increases rather than
right. So again, you're not necessarily making some big drastic conclusion. You're just saying that they might argue fraud applied because we're not sure whether it was done sort of without all the facts or really not done with the best of intent. Yeah.
For fraud, could we have said anything, or like duress, could we have said anything about the duress of the people who would sign on, or like sign the other contract that they gave him?
Yeah, I think you could have mentioned that as maybe as a way to show that the formation had some defects in it, that it wasn't done honestly. Again, remember the whole point of formation defects or fraud is that something in the initial agreement that they're signing, so the piece of paper in front of us, just was wrong or not done truthfully, and therefore we're going to want to hear what was outside that document to help us better understand, well, yeah, why would he have signed on to this clause that seems to really limit his ability to do X or do Y? Well, it's because we didn't hear that, he was told if he didn't sign that he was going to have his house repossessed, So things like that. You're going to kind of tell from the fact pattern that something just doesn't seem right with the way the parties interacted, and so we're going to try and think of a way to let that in. Yeah.
I don't know if she was getting to this part, but I did talk about how they kind of were forcing him to sign that, the new contract. So would that be, could you argue that, well, if in the original contract it says, they could increase or decrease, why does he have to sign a new one? I don't know where I was what exception I was getting to, but
See, that again, you bring up a really good point. There are going to be some facts that maybe don't specifically fit into an exception. But if you have this list of 6 or 7 exceptions you're trying to work with and want to make an argument that it fits in one of them, by taking that fact and arguing, well, this might be seen as fraud because it seems like they were doing something fishy and trying to get him to sign this document, and if we're worried about formation being defective, that might help him out, then yeah, you see how you've taken a very specific fact, and again, this is step 3 of our process, taking the fact and plugging in where it would most be beneficial for our client or for whatever argument you're trying to make. And yeah, that's great. I mean, it may not be the best argument, but you're working with the facts. So you've taken your checklist, you've decided what rule you're going to use, and you figured out what facts are going to help you explain this. This would be fraud because we see this. He made him sign a subsequent contract that doesn't even seem relevant, that makes him worse off. Yeah, I mean, it's maybe not the best fitting to fraud, but it's an argument. I mean, I can see where you're going as a professor there. And it helps me understand what the elements mean because you used because and gave me a fact. Alright, we're almost done, you guys. So the 2 we have left that we could argue here is collateral agreements. And the issue with collateral agreements from the facts is, we're back to this idea that you were asking for clarification on a side agreement. Something that's not in the writing, but seems really relevant and is still related to. So what do we have here that kind of fits that idea? Yeah, again, I think they even say side agreements in the text, right? I mean, if you have your checklist in your mind, you're like collateral agreements, side agreements, and you see side agreements in the text, you're going to be like, oh, that should make me think, is this going to fit in collateral agreements? And again, all this starts with that checklist being detailed and knowing, I call them, I'll take a little side. You'll learn I love these. I call them kind of triggers in my outline, and we didn't really put these in for you guys, but if I'm writing about exceptions and I have a condition precedent, and I'm like, what the hell does that mean, right? I sometimes will put, or I'll go ask the professor, what does this really mean, or what example would happen in real life, and then I came up with one about the lease for you guys, and I would type that into my exam, well, let's say we have a lease between 2 people, and the contract will only work if they get the parking spot. Now I know what that means, right? Or if it's about the dog being leased. And I try and kind of play with it and put it into my own words, because if I can come up with a real-life situation where I've talked about that, I know what the rule means. So as I'm listing the rule on my exam, take a step back. If I'm reading through an exam, and I have these like 6 exceptions running through my mind, and I see something about them contracting, and then they're saying, oh, but we won't put the idea about profitability into writing because we'll talk about that later. I'm like, oh, that reminds me of my parking example. And that's the way you try and create these checklists that work for you for any fact pattern. Okay, so then again, we have that small analysis. And notice, you guys, some of these analyses are one sentence, right? Because it's a, this is met or not met because, list the fact that applies, and then give me why, well, yes or no, a conclusion. And again, we finish up with promissory estoppel. So the rule for promissory estoppel is actually longer than the application and conclusion. This will be the case sometimes. It doesn't mean skip it. It just means that there's probably not a very beefy argument for it. So here we have, promise, which has been detrimentally relied on, blah, 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 and hopefully, you have that spit out. But then I'm like, okay, so what are we going to show that makes it seem as though Keynes detrimentally relied on something that the other party told him? And if we were looking through the fact pattern, what might help us? I know I have given it to you guys, but did anyone write about this on their own? Yeah.
The fact that he moved. I said that he moved.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So we have all these things that we've kind of learned about from last semester, like what steps did he take that he wouldn't otherwise have but for this promise? He moved to California, he resigned his other job, and we do have a very clear promise that, if you help me build profitability or, meet the profitability standards, then, will get, your job is going to be for, what I think he justified how long it would be. But, and then you notice the conclusion based off those just couple facts is therefore promissory estoppel should apply here. So each separate exception is going to have a very different conclusion to it depending on the facts you're given. Okay. So I know that's a lot to take in an hour. It's a lot for me to go through as a 2L in an hour up here, having prepared. What I really, really, really encourage you guys to do is, I'm a process person, this is how I learn. If I don't do this process, things don't make sense to me for law school. I encourage you to look at this process and be like, okay, I have these notes and these briefs, and my goal is to make something that resembles an outline, and then from my outline create a checklist that I can actually approach a problem with, right? It's 3 steps before we even look at addressing a problem. So I'm hoping that between today's session, you guys will be getting comments back from your personal Dean's Fellows by Monday from your sample answer. And we didn't expect your guys' answer to look like ours. We were looking for some certain things that we'll let you guys know. Like structure, we're really going to hone in on you guys. Applying facts, even if they may not be the best facts, but really making that good faith effort to take facts from the fact pattern that are relevant. And then finally, we'll start to discuss later in the semester how we decide when to make counter arguments and further, really decide how long to spend on each topic depending on what's provided. But again, we're here for you guys. We can help you with any course you guys have. But really try and take this checklist approach and create that for all of your classes, in fact. I'm around for a few more minutes if anyone has questions. Otherwise, I'll see you guys all next time. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Okay.
Stop.